The women huddled in the clearing expected to die that day. What they received instead would shatter everything they'd been taught to believe about their enemy. Summer heat pressed down on the Pacific island like a suffocating blanket, thick with humidity that made every breath feel labored. Beneath the canopy of palms and banyan trees, a group of 40 Japanese women sat in tight clusters, their cotton dresses stained with dirt and sweat, their faces masks of resignation. Around them, American soldiers formed a loose perimeter, rifles held at ready but not aimed, their own uniforms dark with perspiration after the morning's sweep through the jungle. Before we continue with this remarkable story of humanity in wartime, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical accounts that challenge what we think we know about the past. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Lieutenant James Crawford stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the captured women with a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. He was 24 years old, though the past 3 years of island-hopping combat had etched lines around his eyes that made him look a decade older. Behind him, Sergeant Robert Hayes was organizing the men, keeping voices low, maintaining distance. They had found the women in a makeshift camp 2 miles inland, evacuated from the main settlement when the surrender came. Some had been nurses, others civilian workers attached to the Japanese garrison. All of them had been left behind in the chaos of capitulation. Crawford had seen fear before. He'd seen it in the eyes of wounded men waiting for morphine, in the faces of replacements fresh off the transports before their first engagement. But this was different. This was terror so profound it seemed to have frozen the women into statues. They weren't crying or pleading. They simply waited, silent and still, for what they believed was inevitable. One woman near the center of the group clutched something in her closed fist. Crawford noticed the white-knuckled grip, the way her arm trembled with the effort of holding whatever it was. He'd been briefed about this, about the propaganda that had saturated Japanese civilian consciousness for years. Stories of American savagery, of unspeakable treatment awaiting prisoners, of fates worse than death. The brass had warned them that civilians, especially women, might attempt suicide rather than face capture. The woman's hand moved slightly toward her mouth. Crawford didn't think. He crossed the clearing in 5 quick strides, dropping to one knee in front of her. She flinched violently, her eyes going wide, and several other women gasped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Crawford slowly extended his hand, palm up, and spoke in the few words of Japanese he'd learned from the intelligence officer. "Anzen desu," he said, his pronunciation clumsy but earnest. "Safe. You are safe." The woman stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her fist remained clenched. Crawford could see she was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a round face and dark eyes that held nothing but dread. He kept his hand extended, his posture non-threatening, and repeated the words. Behind him, Hayes had moved up quietly, and now the sergeant knelt as well, pulling his canteen from his belt. He unscrewed the cap slowly, deliberately, and took a small sip himself before offering it toward the nearest group of women. No one moved to take it. The metal container gleamed in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, condensation beating on its surface. Crawford remained focused on the woman in front of him. Her hand was shaking now, the tremor running up her entire arm. He could see tears forming at the corners of her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in silent tracks. She was breaking, he realized, not from fear of what he might do, but from the impossibility of what he wasn't doing. He wasn't shouting, wasn't striking her, wasn't dragging her away. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face, years of indoctrination colliding with present reality. "Please," Crawford said softly, still holding out his hand. "Let me help you." The woman's fingers slowly uncurled. In her palm lay a small glass vial, the kind that might contain medicine or perfume. Crawford knew immediately what it was. Cyanide, probably, or some other quick-acting poison. She'd been ready to swallow it rather than face capture. His throat tightened as he carefully took the vial from her hand, their fingers brushing for just a moment. Her skin was fever-hot despite the shade. Hayes was having slightly better luck with the canteen. One of the older women, gray streaking her dark hair, had accepted it with trembling hands and taken a cautious sip. When nothing happened to her, when Hayes simply nodded encouragingly and gestured for her to drink more, something shifted in the group's atmosphere. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Crawford felt it, a microscopic loosening of the suffocating tension. "Get the medical supplies," Crawford told Hayes without looking away from the women. "And food, whatever we can spare." "Sir, we're already running low on rations," Hayes pointed out, though his tone suggested he was merely stating facts, not objecting. "I know. Do it anyway." As Hayes moved off, Crawford slowly stood and backed away, giving the women space. He pulled the vial from his pocket and very deliberately walked to the edge of the clearing, where he poured its contents onto the ground and crushed the empty glass under his boot heel. Several of the women watched this action with expressions he couldn't quite read. Relief, perhaps, or confusion, or both. Private Danny O'Brien appeared with a crate of sea rations, his red hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was barely 18, young enough that he should still be worrying about baseball games and dances, not prisoner management in the aftermath of the most brutal war the world had ever seen. But he set the crate down with the same careful gentleness Crawford had seen him use when handling wounded men, and began opening tins of meat and crackers. "How do we, give it to them?" O'Brien asked quietly. "Without spooking them more?" It was a good question. Crawford surveyed the clearing, thinking. The women were still clustered together, still watchful and wary, though the immediate panic seemed to have subsided slightly. The older woman who'd accepted the canteen was now passing it to others in her group, and that was something. That was a start. "We eat first," Crawford decided. "Let them see it's safe. Then we leave it within reach and back off. Let them come to it on their own terms." So that's what they did. Crawford, Hayes, and O'Brien sat down in a loose semicircle about 10 feet from the nearest group of women and opened their own rations. They ate slowly, making conversation about inconsequential things, the weather, the quality of the canned hash, anything to project normalcy. Crawford could feel the women watching every movement, cataloging every gesture. He took a long drink from his canteen, then set it on the ground between himself and them. After a moment's hesitation, he added a chocolate bar from his personal stash. Time moved strangely in the jungle. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in shafts of golden light that illuminated dust motes and insects. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, its voice sharp and alien. The war had officially ended 3 days ago with the Emperor's surrender broadcast. But here on this small island, with its destroyed airstrip and abandoned fortifications, the peace felt tenuous and unreal. One of the younger women broke first. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her collarbones prominent beneath her dress, and Crawford guessed she'd been surviving on minimal rations for weeks, maybe months. She crawled forward, moving with the painful slowness of someone expecting a blow at any moment, and reached for the chocolate bar. Her fingers closed around it, and she waited, frozen, for a reaction. Crawford looked away, making a show of examining his rifle's sights. From the corner of his eye, he saw the woman retreat with her prize, saw her break the chocolate into pieces and share it with 2 others. The brown squares disappeared in seconds, barely tasted in their hunger. That opened the floodgates, though not dramatically. The women approached the food in 1s and 2s, never turning their backs, never losing their wariness, but driven by hunger stronger than fear. They took the tins of meat and crackers, the packets of instant coffee, the hard biscuits that required soaking before they were edible. They ate sitting down in their groups, and Crawford noticed they were crying as they did so, silent tears that spoke of relief and confusion and the overwhelming strangeness of the moment. By noon, more soldiers had arrived with supplies from the main camp. Corporal Andrew Martinez brought blankets and a canvas tarp that could serve as shade. Private First Class William Chun, whose grandparents had immigrated from China, attempted to communicate with the women in Mandarin, but the language barrier proved too great. Still, his gentle demeanor helped. So did the fact that he was setting up a latrine area with privacy screens made from salvaged materials, anticipating needs without being asked. Lieutenant Crawford had sent a runner back to headquarters with a request for a translator and medical personnel. Until they arrived, he and his men were improvising. Hayes had some basic medical training and was examining the women for injuries or illnesses, working with infinite patience through gestures and simple demonstrations. Several had infected cuts or tropical ulcers. One elderly woman had a fever that concerned him. "We need to get her to the field hospital," Hayes told Crawford after a careful examination. "This looks like dengue, maybe worse. She's severely dehydrated." The elderly woman, her face deeply lined and her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, shook her head vigorously when Hayes tried to help her stand. She spoke rapidly in Japanese, her tone urgent and frightened, gesturing toward the other women. Crawford didn't need a translation to understand. She was afraid of being separated from her group, afraid that leaving meant disappearing. "Tell her," Crawford said to Chan, who was attempting to learn some basic Japanese phrases from one of the younger women who seemed slightly less terrified than the others. "Tell her we'll send someone with her, someone from her group. They can both come back tomorrow." The message took several attempts to convey, passing through multiple intermediaries and a lot of hand gestures, but eventually, the elderly woman consented. One of the middle-aged women volunteered to accompany her, and Hayes organized their transport on a makeshift stretcher. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the clearing continued to shift. The women were still frightened, still uncertain, but the sharp edge of terror had dulled. Some were even talking quietly among themselves, though they fell silent whenever a soldier came too close. Crawford noticed they had organized themselves into a clear hierarchy, with certain women making decisions for the group. The one who had volunteered to accompany the sick woman seemed to be a leader of sorts, as did a stern-faced woman in her 30s who wore the remnants of what might have been a nurse's uniform. When the translator finally arrived in late afternoon, she was not what Crawford had expected. Captain Sarah Morrison was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American from California, and she carried herself with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent the war proving her loyalty over and over again. She'd been working with military intelligence, she explained to Crawford, helping to process documents and interrogate prisoners. "These women aren't prisoners in the traditional sense," Crawford said as they walked toward the clearing. "They're civilians who were left behind, and they're terrified." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I know what they've been told about us," she said quietly. "My grandparents believed some of the same propaganda. It's going to take more than one day of decent treatment to undo years of indoctrination." She was right, of course. But as Morrison began speaking to the women in fluent Japanese, Crawford watched their faces transform. Here was someone who looked like them, spoke their language, and wore an American uniform. The contradiction seemed to fascinate and unsettle them in equal measure. The stern-faced woman in the nurse's uniform emerged as the primary spokesperson for the group. Her name was Yoshida Keiko, Morrison translated, and she had been a civilian nurse attached to the garrison hospital. She had been trained to commit suicide rather than surrender. She had been prepared to encourage the other women to do the same. But now she was confused and frightened in a different way, uncertain of what this unexpected humanity meant for their futures. "Where will you take us?" Keiko asked through Morrison, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What will happen to us?" "You'll be processed as displaced civilians," Crawford explained, waiting for Morrison to translate. "We'll try to establish your identities, find out where you're from, and eventually repatriate you to Japan once the situation stabilizes. In the meantime, you'll be housed in a civilian internment camp. You'll have shelter, food, medical care. And we will not be—" Keiko hesitated, searching for words. "Harmed." "No," Crawford said firmly, meeting her gaze. "You will not be harmed. You have my word as an officer." Morrison translated, and Crawford saw something flicker across Keiko's face. Not quite belief, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of hope. She bowed slightly, a formal gesture, and spoke again. "She says they will cooperate," Morrison told Crawford. "She's asking permission to speak with the other women, to help them understand what's happening." "Of course. And Captain Morrison, please tell them—" Crawford paused, choosing his words carefully. Please tell them that we know they're frightened. We know what they've been told to expect. But we're not here to hurt them. We just want to help them get home." As Morrison translated, Crawford saw several of the women begin to cry again. But this time the tears seemed different. Less desperate, more overwhelmed. The young woman who had been holding the poison vial covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. An older woman beside her wrapped an arm around her, murmuring softly. That evening, as the sun began to set and the jungle filled with the sounds of night insects, the soldiers set up a proper camp. They strung up mosquito netting, arranged the blankets into sleeping areas, and built a small fire for warmth and light. O'Brien had somehow procured rice from the quartermaster, and they boiled it with some of the canned meat to make a simple but filling meal. The women ate their portions slowly, savoring each bite with an intensity that spoke of long deprivation. Crawford sat apart from the main group, writing a report by flashlight. He tried to capture what had happened today, the strange and tentative bridge that had been built between former enemies. But words felt inadequate. How did you describe the moment when propaganda crumbled in the face of simple kindness? How did you quantify the value of a canteen of water offered without strings? A blanket given without demands? "Sir," O'Brien had approached quietly. "The women, they wanted me to give you something." He held out a small object. In the dim light, Crawford couldn't quite see what it was until he took it. A origami crane, folded from a scrap of paper, the creases sharp and precise. The paper was from a ration box, he realized. The printed English instructions on one side transformed into something delicate and beautiful. "The young one made it," O'Brien explained. "The one you took the poison from. Captain Morrison says it's a symbol of peace. Or hope. Something like that." Crawford turned the crane over in his hands, feeling the fragile paper. "Tell her thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Tell her I'll keep it safe." The night passed without incident. The soldiers maintained a watch, but it was more for protection than surveillance. Wild pigs had been known to raid camps, and there were always concerns about holdout Japanese soldiers who hadn't received word of the surrender. But the women slept peacefully, or as peacefully as possible given the circumstances. Crawford checked on them several times during his watch, seeing the rise and fall of their breathing in the moonlight, the way they'd clustered together for comfort and warmth. In the morning, trucks arrived to transport them to the main internment facility. It was a former Japanese barracks that had been hastily converted, Morrison explained, with separate quarters for women, basic sanitation, and a mess hall. Not comfortable exactly, but secure and clean. As the women were helped into the trucks, several of them turned to look back at Crawford and his men. One woman, the young one who'd made the crane, raised her hand in a small wave. Crawford waved back, aware that he was witnessing something significant, even if he couldn't quite articulate what it was. The internment camp was a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by wire fencing, situated on a cleared hilltop with views of the ocean. It housed several hundred Japanese civilians, mostly women and children who had been evacuated from combat zones or left behind in the chaos of surrender. The conditions were basic but humane. Families were kept together where possible. Children attended makeshift schools. There was a small garden where residents could grow vegetables. It was nothing like the concentration camps Crawford had heard about in Germany, nothing like the brutal prisoner of war camps the Japanese had operated. It was simply a temporary holding facility for people caught on the wrong side of history. Captain Morrison arranged for Crawford to visit the camp a week after the women's arrival. She thought it might help, she said, for them to see a familiar face, to understand that the promises made in the jungle clearing were being kept. Crawford agreed, though he felt uncertain about what he could possibly accomplish. He was just one lieutenant among thousands of American servicemen in the Pacific. He'd done his job, nothing more. The women were gathered in a common room, a bare space with concrete floors and walls decorated with children's drawings. They looked different than they had in the jungle. Clean, for one thing. Their hair was washed and combed, their clothes mended. They'd gained back some of the weight hunger had stolen. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in their bearing. They sat up straighter, made eye contact, smiled tentatively when Morrison introduced Crawford. Keiko, the former nurse, stepped forward. She'd been appointed a sort of liaison for the women Morrison had told him, helping to bridge the gap between the internees and the American administration. She spoke in Japanese and Morrison translated. She says they've been treated well, Morrison explained. Better than expected. Better than they believed possible. She wants to know if the men who helped them that first day, if they're all right, if the war has ended for them too. Crawford felt a lump in his throat. Tell her we're fine. Tell her we're all just trying to figure out what peace looks like. There was more conversation, questions about the process of repatriation, about family members who might be looking for them, about the state of Japan itself after the atomic bombs and the surrender. Crawford answered what he could, admitted ignorance when he didn't know. Throughout it all, he kept glancing at the young woman who'd given him the paper crane. She sat slightly apart from the others, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Finally, through Morrison, he asked if she was all right. The young woman smiled, and it transformed her face. She spoke softly, almost shyly. She says her name is Haruko, Morrison translated. She wants you to know that she writes letters to her mother in Nagasaki, or what's left of Nagasaki. And in those letters, she tells her mother about the American soldiers who fed them first, who gave them water before asking their names, who treated them like human beings when they expected monsters. She says, Morrison continued, her own voice growing thick with emotion, that her mother won't believe her at first. No one in Japan will believe these stories. But she and the other women will tell them anyway, because someone needs to know that kindness happened here. That mercy was possible even in war. Crawford didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. He thought about all the things he'd seen in 3 years of combat. The brutality, the waste, the casual cruelty that war bred in otherwise decent men. He thought about the propaganda both sides had used, dehumanizing the enemy, making it easier to kill and die. And he thought about a clearing in the jungle where 40 women had expected death and received bread instead. Tell her, he said finally. Tell her that we're just men. We're not heroes or saviors. We're just trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. But if these stories help, if they make the peace easier to build, then I'm glad. Tell her I hope she sees her mother again soon. The translation brought tears to Haruko's eyes, but she was smiling through them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another paper crane, this one folded from a piece of clean white paper. She offered it to Crawford with both hands, bowing slightly. Morrison's voice was gentle. She says this one is folded with hope, not fear. She wants you to have it as a reminder that good can come from terrible times. Crawford accepted the crane with the same formal bow, holding it carefully. It seemed impossibly fragile, this small paper bird, and yet it represented something stronger than steel. Evidence that propaganda could crumble, that hate could give way to understanding, that even in the aftermath of the most destructive war humanity had ever waged, individual acts of decency could still matter. The visit didn't last long. Crawford had duties to attend to, reports to file, the endless paperwork of military bureaucracy. But as he left the camp, he carried with him a sense of possibility. The war was over, truly over, and now came the harder work of building something from the ruins. It wouldn't be easy. Too much blood had been spilled, too many lives destroyed. The scars would take generations to heal, but it would start with moments like these, with soldiers offering water to terrified women, with women choosing to believe in humanity despite everything they'd been taught, with paper cranes folded from hope instead of fear. 3 months later, Crawford received orders to return stateside. The occupation of Japan was well underway. The internment camps were being phased out as repatriation efforts accelerated, and men with enough service points were being sent home. He spent his last weeks in the Pacific helping to dismantle the infrastructure of war, converting barracks into civilian housing, distributing supplies to devastated communities, watching as the rigid structures of military occupation gradually softened into something more like partnership. On his final day, Captain Morrison found him at the docks where his transport ship was loading. She carried a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. From Keiko and the others, she said, pressing it into his hands. They wanted you to have this before you left. Crawford opened the package carefully. Inside was a collection of items, small tokens and mementos. A photograph of the women standing together in the camp, their faces solemn but no longer terrified. A letter in Japanese with Morrison's translation attached, thanking him and his men for their kindness. And dozens of paper cranes, each one folded from different colored paper, each one unique. They've been teaching the children to make them, Morrison explained. There's a tradition, they say, that if you fold 1,000 cranes, you get a wish. They're making them for peace, for remembrance, for all the things that were lost and all the things that might still be saved. Crawford held one of the cranes up to the light. Through the translucent paper, he could see the shadow of his own hand, the lines of his palm, the traces of war written on his skin. But the crane itself was perfect, each fold crisp and intentional, a small act of creation in a world that had seen too much destruction. Will they be all right? He asked Morrison. When they go back to Japan, will they be able to rebuild their lives? Morrison considered the question carefully. I don't know, she admitted. Japan is devastated. The cities are in ruins. Food is scarce. And these women, they'll face questions about where they were, what they did during the war. Some people might not believe their stories about American kindness. Some might not want to believe. But they'll tell them anyway, Crawford said, remembering Haruko's determined smile. Yes, Morrison agreed. They'll tell them anyway. And maybe, slowly, those stories will change things. Maybe they'll make the next generation a little less eager for war. Maybe they'll remember that enemies can become something else. Not friends, necessarily. But not monsters either. Just people. The ship's horn sounded, announcing final boarding. Crawford tucked the package under his arm and shook Morrison's hand. Thank you, Captain, for everything you did for them, for helping us understand. I didn't do it for you, Morrison said, but her tone was warm, not harsh. I did it because someone needs to remember that we're all capable of being better than our worst moments. Even in war. Especially in war. Crawford thought about that as the ship pulled away from the dock, as the island receded into the distance, as the vast Pacific stretched out before him. He thought about all the battles he'd fought, all the lives lost, all the anger and fear that had driven men to inconceivable acts. And he thought about 40 women in a jungle clearing who had expected death and received bread instead. Years later, when people asked him about the war, Crawford would tell them about the campaigns, the victories, the friends who hadn't made it home. But he would also tell them about the women, about Haruko and her paper cranes, about Keiko and her determination to survive not just physically but morally, to maintain her humanity in the face of everything that had tried to strip it away, about the small act of offering water that had rippled out into something larger, something that mattered. He kept the cranes in a box on his desk, carefully preserved. Sometimes, when the memories of combat became too heavy, he would take them out and hold them, remembering that war was not the only thing humans were capable of creating. They could also make beauty. They could also choose kindness. They could also recognize the humanity in those they'd been taught to hate. The stories did spread, slowly but surely. Letters made it back to Japan, carrying accounts of American soldiers who fed their captives first, who provided medical care without demands, who treated prisoners with unexpected dignity. Not every story was like this, of course. War was still war, and brutality still existed. But these small narratives of mercy carved out space for something different, a counter-narrative to the propaganda of hate. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt and relations between former enemies evolved into alliance, some of these stories were published. Haruko wrote a memoir in the 1960s, describing her experience of capture and internment, the terror that had been so carefully cultivated by propaganda and the shocking reality of humane treatment. Keiko became a nurse again in a hospital in Tokyo, and she trained younger nurses with a philosophy shaped by what she'd learned in that internment camp, that care for the vulnerable was not weakness but the highest calling of their profession. And Crawford, returning to a civilian life that felt strange and unfamiliar after years of combat, became a teacher. He taught history to high school students in a small town in Oregon, and he made sure his lessons included not just the grand narratives of battles and treaties, but the small moments of humanity that persisted even in the darkest times. He brought out his box of paper cranes and passed them around the classroom, letting his students hold these fragile artifacts while he told them about 40 women who had been shocked when their captors fed them first. War brings out the worst in us, he would tell his students, his voice carrying the weight of experience they couldn't yet understand. It's designed to do that, but it doesn't erase our capacity for good. It doesn't destroy our ability to choose mercy over cruelty, kindness over convenience. Those choices are always available to us, even in the worst circumstances. Especially in the worst circumstances, because that's when they matter most. The students would listen, holding their paper cranes, trying to imagine a time when the world was at war and people had to make such choices. Some understood immediately. Others would only grasp it later, when they faced their own moral crossroads. But the seeds were planted. These stories of mercy in wartime, passed down through generations like the ancient art of folding paper into birds. Crawford lived to be 87 years old. In his final years, as his body grew frail but his mind remained sharp, he received a letter from Japan. It was from Haruko's daughter, a woman he'd never met but who knew his story through her mother's telling. Haruko had passed away peacefully, the letter explained, surrounded by family in the home she'd built after the war. In her final days, she had spoken often of the American lieutenant who had saved her life, not through any heroic action, but through simple human decency at a moment when she needed it most. The letter included a photograph. It showed an elderly Haruko, her face deeply lined but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and determination Crawford remembered, standing beside a monument in a park. The monument was covered in paper cranes, thousands of them, each one representing a prayer for peace. Haruko's daughter explained that her mother had spent decades folding cranes and teaching others to fold them, contributing to the tradition that had grown out of Hiroshima's legacy. Peace through remembrance. Hope through small, repeated acts of creation. Crawford held that photograph for a long time, feeling the weight of years and memory pressing down on him. He thought about all the paths his life might have taken, all the choices he might have made differently. But in that jungle clearing in the summer of 1945, he had chosen kindness. His men had chosen mercy. And that choice, small as it seemed at the time, had rippled forward through decades, touching lives and shaping stories in ways he never could have imagined. The paper cranes remained on his desk until the end. When Crawford died, his children donated them to a museum, where they were displayed alongside his uniform and medals and the letter from Haruko's daughter. The exhibit was titled Mercy in Wartime. Small acts, lasting impact, and it drew visitors from around the world. Veterans came to remember, students came to learn, and people who had never experienced war came to understand that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could still find a way through. The cranes hung from the ceiling on invisible threads, dozens of them, turning slowly in the climate-controlled air of the museum. Each one was different, folded by different hands, but all carried the same message. That enemies could recognize each other's humanity. That propaganda could crumble in the face of kindness. That the simple act of feeding someone before asking their name could change the course of lives and reshape the narratives of history. In the end, perhaps that was the truest victory to come out of the war. Not the military triumphs or territorial gains, but the quiet moments when individuals chose to see past the uniforms and flags and recognize the vulnerable human being standing before them. The women in that jungle clearing had expected monsters and found men instead. And in that unexpected mercy, they discovered something powerful enough to build a peace upon. The cranes continued to turn in the museum's filtered light, casting small shadows that danced across the walls. Visitors stopped to read the plaques, to learn the names, to understand the context. And somewhere in the midst of all that official history and careful preservation, the essential truth remained, simple and profound. They had fed them first. Before questions, before processing, before all the machinery of war and its aftermath, they had offered food and water and basic human dignity. And that had made all the difference. Among the visitors who came to see the exhibit was a young journalist named Rachel Park, working on a documentary about reconciliation in the aftermath of war. She had interviewed veterans from multiple conflicts, studied psychological trauma, examined the long-term effects of combat on both soldiers and civilians. But something about this particular story caught her attention in a way the others hadn't. Perhaps it was the paper cranes themselves, so delicate and beautiful, each one a small defiance against the crushing weight of military might. Or perhaps it was the photograph of Lieutenant Crawford and the women, taken years after the war at a reunion none of them had ever expected to attend. Rachel spent weeks researching, tracking down descendants of the soldiers who had been in that clearing, finding relatives of the Japanese women who had survived and eventually returned home. Each interview added layers to the story, filling in details that the museum plaques couldn't capture. She learned that Private O'Brien had struggled with survivor's guilt for decades, tormented by the friends he'd lost in combat, finding solace only in remembering the lives he'd helped preserve. She discovered that Sergeant Hayes had become a physician after the war, working in underserved communities, his approach to medicine shaped by those days in the Pacific when healing meant more than just treating physical wounds. One of her most significant interviews was with Margaret Chen, the daughter of Private First Class William Chun. Margaret was in her 70s now, a retired professor of Asian American studies, and she had grown up hearing her father's stories about the war. But there was one story he told more than any other. She explained to Rachel the story of the women in the jungle. "My father never considered himself a hero," Margaret said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime studying language and meaning. "He said he was just doing what made sense, what felt human. But I think it haunted him in a different way than the combat did. The combat was something that happened to him, something he survived. But that day in the clearing, that was a choice he and the other men made. They could have been harsh, could have been indifferent, could have treated those women as enemies or threats. Instead, they chose to see them as people first." She showed Rachel a box her father had kept, filled with letters and photographs. Among them was a letter from Keiko, written in careful English she had learned after the war. The letter was dated 1968, more than 2 decades after the surrender, and it described Keiko's life in Tokyo, her work at the hospital, her daughter who was studying to become a doctor. But the heart of the letter was a simple statement of gratitude, an acknowledgement that William Chen's kindness had given her a reason to believe in the possibility of peace. "My father wept when he received that letter," Margaret told Rachel. "I was 12 years old, and I'd never seen him cry before. He sat at the kitchen table and read it over and over, and then he looked at my mother and said, 'She remembered. After all these years, she remembered.' As if he'd been worried that those moments of mercy might have been lost, swallowed up by all the violence and hatred that surrounded them." Rachel included this interview in her documentary, along with footage of Margaret visiting the museum exhibit, standing before the paper cranes with tears streaming down her face. The documentary aired on public television and later found a wider audience online, where it sparked conversations about the nature of reconciliation, the long shadow of war, and the ways individual acts of compassion could ripple through generations. One viewer who watched the documentary with particular intensity was David Morrison, the grandson of Captain Sarah Morrison. David was a graduate student studying international relations, focused on conflict resolution in post-war societies. He had known his grandmother's story, of course, had grown up proud of her service as a translator. But the documentary revealed aspects of her experience he'd never fully understood. He called her immediately after watching. Sarah was 96 years old, living in an assisted care facility in San Francisco, but her mind was still sharp, her memory still vivid when it came to those months working with the internees. "Grandmother," David said, his voice urgent over the phone. "The documentary, the one about Lieutenant Crawford and the Japanese women, I had no idea you were so central to that story." Sarah's laugh was dry but warm. "Oh, I wasn't central, David. I was just the voice. Crawford and his men, they were the ones who made the real choice. I just helped everyone understand each other." "But you were the bridge," David insisted. "Without you, they couldn't have communicated, couldn't have built trust." There was a long pause. David could hear the sounds of the facility in the background, muted television chatter, the soft footsteps of nurses making their rounds. When his grandmother spoke again, her voice had a quality he'd rarely heard, something vulnerable and raw. "You know what I remember most?" she said. "Not the big moments, not the official processing or the repatriation efforts. I remember the small conversations. The women asking me if I thought their families had survived. The mothers worrying about children they'd been separated from. And I remember lying to them sometimes, David, telling them I was sure everything would be fine, that they'd be reunited soon, when I had no idea if that was true. Some of those families had been in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Some of them were simply gone, erased by the bombs or the firebombing campaigns. But what else could I tell them? They needed hope more than they needed honesty." David listened, holding his phone tightly, understanding for the first time the moral weight his grandmother had carried. She hadn't just translated words. She had translated hope and fear and grief, had served as the conduit through which two groups of people, former enemies, tried to find their way back to some shared humanity. "Did you ever regret it?" he asked. "The lies, the false hope?" "Every day," Sarah admitted. "But I'd do it again, because some of them did find their families. Some of them did rebuild their lives. And even the ones who lost everything, they deserved to have hope in those dark days. They deserved to believe that the world could still contain kindness." David incorporated his grandmother's reflections into his dissertation, which examined the role of individual actors in post-conflict reconciliation. His work caught the attention of several international organizations, and he eventually became a consultant for groups working in areas recovering from civil wars and ethnic conflicts. He carried with him always the lesson his grandmother had taught him, that healing required not just policy and infrastructure, but individual human connections, moments of vulnerability and trust that transcended official narratives. Meanwhile, in Japan, the story of the jungle clearing had become part of a larger cultural reckoning. The generation born after the war, free from the propaganda that had shaped their parents' worldview, was more willing to examine the complexities of their history. They asked difficult questions about their country's role in the war, about the atrocities committed in their name, but they also sought out stories of humanity that had persisted despite everything. A theater company in Osaka produced a play based on Haruko's memoir, focusing on that pivotal day when fear gave way to tentative hope. The production was spare and powerful, using minimal sets and lighting to create an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. The actress playing Haruko delivered her lines with a trembling intensity that left audiences breathless, particularly in the scene where she extended the paper crane to the American lieutenant. The play toured throughout Japan, playing to packed houses in Tokyo, Kyoto, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. In each city, the audience response was different but equally profound. In Hiroshima, where the atomic bomb had left its permanent scar on the landscape and the collective memory, many viewers wept openly. In Tokyo, businessmen and students alike sat in stunned silence as the play unfolded. And in Nagasaki, Haruko's hometown, her surviving relatives attended the opening night and stood for a curtain call, acknowledging the courage it took to tell this story, to admit to the fear and the shame and the unexpected mercy that had changed everything. The playwright, a woman named Tanaka Yuki, had spent 2 years researching the story, traveling to the United States to interview descendants of the American soldiers, studying archival footage and photographs, immersing herself in the psychological landscape of that moment in history. In an interview with a national newspaper, she explained her motivation. "We spend so much time studying the big events," Yuki said. "The battles, the bombings, the surrender. But history is also made in small moments between individuals. When Lieutenant Crawford offered that canteen of water, he wasn't thinking about history. He was just being human. But that humanity had consequences. It changed how those women saw Americans. It changed how they told their children about the war. It planted seeds of reconciliation that took decades to grow, but eventually bore fruit in the form of the alliance between our nations." The interview was reprinted and discussed widely, sparking debates in schools and universities about how war should be taught, how memory should be preserved, how forgiveness could be fostered without forgetting the very real horrors that had occurred. Some argued that focusing on these small acts of mercy risked minimizing the larger atrocities. Others countered that remembering the humanity that survived even in the worst circumstances was essential for preventing future conflicts. Among those following these debates was Professor Nakamura Hiroshi, a historian at Waseda University who specialized in the American occupation of Japan. He had read Haruko's memoir years ago and been struck by her description of that first day in American custody. Now, seeing the renewed interest in the story, he decided to conduct a comprehensive study of similar incidents, moments when occupying forces had shown unexpected mercy or when prisoners had been treated with dignity rather than cruelty. His research took him to archives in both Japan and the United States, to dusty boxes of letters and reports that hadn't been examined in decades. What he found both heartened and devastated him. There were more stories like Crawford's than he'd expected, small acts of decency scattered throughout the brutal narrative of the Pacific War. But there were also countless examples of the opposite, of prisoners abused, of civilians terrorized, of both sides descending into savagery that haunted the perpetrators for the rest of their lives. Professor Nakamura published his findings in a book titled Mercy and Brutality: Individual Choice in the Pacific War. The book became a bestseller in Japan and was translated into English, Korean, and Chinese. In it, he argued that focusing on the extremes, either the worst atrocities or the most inspiring acts of kindness, missed the crucial point. Most soldiers, most of the time, existed in a moral gray zone, doing what they were told, following orders, trying to survive. The remarkable thing about Crawford and his men was not that they were exceptionally good people, but that they had recognized a moment where they could choose to be better than the situation required, and they had made that choice. War does not erase our agency, Nakamura wrote in his conclusion. It constrains it, certainly. It creates pressures and circumstances that make cruelty easier and compassion harder. But the capacity for moral choice remains. Lieutenant Crawford and his men proved that. So did Yoshida Keiko and the other women who chose to trust their captors despite everything they'd been taught to believe. These individual choices, made in impossible circumstances, remind us that we are never fully at the mercy of historical forces. We always retain some measure of control over who we choose to be. The book was assigned in history courses throughout Japan and gradually made its way into American curricula as well. Students read about the jungle clearing and the paper cranes, and they wrestled with the questions these stories raised. What would I have done in that situation? How would I have reacted to such fear, such uncertainty? Could I have shown mercy when everything in my training told me to see only enemies? One American student, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh studying at the University of California, Berkeley, was so moved by the story that she decided to trace what had happened to Haruko's paper crane, the first one she had made for Lieutenant Crawford. The museum exhibit had displayed many cranes, but not that original one, the one folded from a ration box in a moment of desperate hope. Where was it now? Jennifer's research became an obsession. She contacted the Crawford family, who directed her to his papers at the Oregon Historical Society. She spent weeks going through boxes of documents, photographs, and personal effects. And finally, in a small envelope tucked into Crawford's personal journal, she found it. The crane was yellowed with age, the creases softened by decades of handling, but it was intact. Crawford had kept it with him always, had touched it in moments of doubt or despair, had used it as a reminder of what was possible even in the darkest times. Jennifer wrote her senior thesis on the crane, examining it not just as a historical artifact but as a symbol of the complex relationship between memory, trauma, and reconciliation. She argued that objects like this, small and seemingly insignificant, carried emotional weight that no official monument could match. The crane had been held by both Haruko and Crawford, had absorbed their hopes and fears, had served as a tangible connection between two people who should have been enemies but chose instead to recognize their shared humanity. Her thesis won several academic awards and was eventually adapted into an article for a popular history magazine. The article included a photograph of the crane, carefully preserved in archival tissue, and the response was overwhelming. Readers wrote in sharing their own stories of family members who had served in the war, who had kept similar mementos, who had struggled with the moral complexity of their experiences. Some letters came from Japan, from families of women who had been interned, expressing gratitude that these stories were finally being told and understood in their full complexity. The renewed attention to the story led to a remarkable reunion. In 2019, 74 years after that day in the jungle clearing, the descendants of Lieutenant Crawford and the descendants of Haruko met in San Francisco. It was organized by a peace organization dedicated to fostering dialogue between former enemies, and it brought together people who had never met but who shared this profound historical connection. Crawford's granddaughter, Emily, was there, along with two of his great-grandchildren. Haruko's grandson, Kenji, had traveled from Tokyo with his teenage daughter, Yui. They met in a community center decorated with paper cranes, hundreds of them, folded by local schoolchildren who had learned the story and wanted to contribute to this moment of remembrance and healing. The meeting was emotional and complicated. There were language barriers and cultural differences, moments of awkwardness and uncertainty. But there was also recognition, a sense that they were all inheritors of something precious and fragile, a legacy of mercy that had been passed down through generations and now demanded to be honored and preserved. Emily brought the original crane, carefully transported in a protective case. When she showed it to Kenji and Yui, explaining how her grandfather had kept it for his entire life, Yui began to cry. She was 16 years old, born into a world where Japan and America were allies, where the war was something she learned about in textbooks, not something that shaped her daily reality. But in that moment, holding the case and looking at the yellowed paper through the clear protection, she felt the weight of history in a way no classroom lesson had ever conveyed. "My great-grandmother made this," she said in careful English, "when she was so frightened she wanted to die. And your grandfather saved her life." "Not just her life," Emily replied gently. "Her hope, her faith in humanity. That's what he really saved." The reunion was filmed and shared online, where it reached millions of viewers around the world. People watched these descendants of former enemies embracing, saw them folding paper cranes together, witnessed them promising to stay in contact and to continue sharing this story. The video was viewed and shared by educators, peace activists, and ordinary people who were hungry for narratives of reconciliation in a world that often seemed defined by division and conflict. But perhaps the most profound impact was the quietest. In the weeks and months following the reunion, teachers around the world began incorporating the story into their lessons about World War II, not as a replacement for the difficult truths about the war's brutality, but as a complement to them, a reminder that even in the midst of organized violence, individual acts of mercy remained possible and powerful.